All right, well, we are at 2:30 and we have, I think there's a pretty full participant list based on what I had for registration, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to Talk 1, Track A. This is Patching Patch Management. I am Josh Drake, and we'll be going through some ideas in patch management as it relates to vulnerability management for a larger organization today. I want to thank everyone for coming. I see a lot of names I know from Research Soc, and some of you I met last year at the NSF Cybersecurity Summit. So that's good. I see a few people from the ARF who names I recognize, and also Gage. So that's great. We'll go ahead and get started. A little bit about myself. I'm a security analyst at Indiana University Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. I've been there since 2019. I wear a few different hats over there. I'm a project manager for the Research Soc, and I also am a contributor to the CICOE pilot, where I run the Identity Management Working Group. And I have another role with the Open Science Grid community, where I work as a member of their security team. And I know a lot of you here are from some of those organizations, so that's great. I have 15 years of experience prior to that in IT. I started out with application support and then did some systems analysis, became a system administrator, and got some network administration credentials. Then I managed a data center in Montana for a while. I've been at organizations of many different sizes. I've worked at large healthcare organizations where we had hundreds of just IT employees managing thousands of endpoints. And I've worked at local municipal governments where there were three of us and a bunch of bubblegum and shoestring trying to keep a network of several hundred computers running. So I've experienced things at the high end of the budget where we had all the toys, bells and whistles, and I've done things on the other end where we just had a dime and a prayer. So hopefully some of what I have to say will be useful for you today. And a reminder that we will have on Thursday a companion to this talk, which is the office hours. And so if you have anything to contribute and anything that I miss or don't go over, any of your own tips and tricks, please come to that. We'll have more of a discussion-based talk on Thursday. And I won't cover everything because patch management is too large for one person to know all of it. And I know what I've worked with, and I'll point you in the directions of trends that I see, but we won't get to everything. Expectations for this talk. We're not going to get real in-depth on technical topics. There's just too much out there, too many different ways that your systems could be set up, too many different budgets and resources that might be available at your organization. So rather than try to go into covering an inch of depth on 100 different topics, I'm going to try to provide a mental model for thinking about comprehensive patch management as it fits into your information security program. So patch management, it is a primary tool in our vulnerability management suite. So we want to try to limit the vulnerabilities that affect our organization. Patch management is our main tool for that. And so we're going to talk about how we think about patch management as if we're a security engineer. One thing that comes up a lot in all of IT, but especially when we're talking about patch management tools, is right, you can only have two of the triangle here. You can get something cheap and good, or good and fast, but not cheap. And especially with these tools, what I found is that if you have a shoestring budget, you can find tools that'll get the job done, but you're going to put in a lot of work on the other side trying to make those work for your environment. Alternatively, some of the large enterprise tools that are very effective and useful, they can cost an arm and a leg. I've paid more for SCCM at one of the organizations than the IT budget was at my other organization for an entire year. So you can definitely find a tool at different price points, but you can get in over your heads quickly in terms of cost. So we'll try to present options at both ends of that spectrum when we can. So I want to start with a poll. CJ, can you put the poll up for everyone? The first poll we have
Yes,
is
let me get it.
has to do with what your server infrastructure looks like and what you're patching on the server side.
People are voting.
And for those of you just coming in after we got started, please go ahead and add at the end of your Zoom name your organization affiliation if you could. You can click the little more button next to your name and hit rename and do that. Yeah, as Oleg points out, there should be an option for none on that poll. That's true. All right. Give it just a few more seconds to vote, and then we'll see the results. Okay, CJ, you want to close it down and
Yes.
can we display? There we go.
Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah, oh, cool. Mostly Linux. That's interesting with the community we have here. So that's pretty cool. I've mostly worked in Windows shops as an admin, so my experience lies largely on the Windows side of things. So I would be very interested in hearing. Some of you may have more experience in that arena than I do, and I'd very much love to have you come to our office hours on Thursday and talk about it. ICS SCADA systems I see on here. We won't have a lot of time to talk about ICS SCADA. That could be a whole nother talk. Patching those systems is often an entirely different proposition to patching traditional IT. So first section here is how to think about patch management like a security engineer. We're going to be using the information security practice principles that are published by CACR. The link is at the top of the page here. The security practice principles are a set of guidelines that are designed to help people talk and think about information security. It is focused on using common terms and not a lot of technical jargon or terms. It's designed so that you can have a discussion between technologists and leadership and administration and cover the basic fundamental principles that underline what we do. A lot of IT, especially in security, is based around these best practices, which are very proscriptive. And to a large extent, those are pretty helpful. But what they don't do is teach us how to think about things that don't fall into those boxes. And so the principles are a place where we can start to think outside the box and apply novel and unique solutions to IT concerns. It also helps us to not get overly caught up in compliance concerns. It lets us think about things from a first principles point of view and perhaps find some holes that we wouldn't have otherwise found. And that's the goal of this talk. I want to give you tools so that you can apply them to your organization, whatever its situation or size is, and we can identify some shortcomings and shore things up. We want to build a momentum and keep moving forward in everything we do in our information security program. So the principles are, there's 7 of them. We're only going to cover 5 today. The first one is comprehensivity. Am I covering all my bases? Opportunity. Am I taking advantage of the tools and resources available to me in my environment? Rigor. What is the correct behavior we want to see and how are we enforcing it? Minimization. Can we make this a smaller target? Can we reduce our surface area for attack? And then compartmentation. And that is internally, can we think of things as distinct units, and can we limit the amount of interaction and trust we're extending internally in our organizations? There's two more: fault tolerance and proportionality. What happens if this fails, and is it worth it? We're not going to go into those today, not because they're not important, just because they're sort of different points to jump off into conversation. I think everyone agrees patch management is worth it. What happens if this fails? We will talk about some strategies for that, but it's not a focus of the talk. So the first principle we want to look at for patch management is comprehensivity. And the question we should ask ourselves in this event is, do I know about all the assets that I'm meant to be patching? And am I taking adequate steps to ensure that they're receiving patches? So the solutions that I'm aware of, and I'm going to talk mostly with tools that I've worked with, there's plenty of others, are hardware asset inventories. If you have a good change management system, your asset inventories can be on paper. There's no reason why a good database or Excel spreadsheet, if it's tracked well, can't serve as your asset inventory. But I found that having some sort of network-based asset inventory program goes a long way towards helping you find different devices on your network, things that you might not even be aware of, and making sure that you have a solution to monitor and patch each of those things. There's a lot of different tools out here in this space. Some of the ones I've used that I could recommend are PDQ, which has an inventory and a deployment module. They're not free, but they are relatively inexpensive, and they do an excellent job at generating inventory based on an IP range and allowing you to do some deployment work as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Snipe It is a tool that we've been testing with the academic research fleet as a basis prerequisite to doing identification and asset management with them. And that is an open source program that you can run and track inventory changes over a long period of time. There's also enterprise solutions like SCCM, SolarWinds, a program I've used called Goverlan, that all have these options. Beyond just patch management, having an accurate asset inventory is pretty important for all of your information security and especially vulnerability management concerns. You need to know what assets you have so that you can monitor them for vulnerabilities, and you need to know what you have so you can monitor when things change. Having a baseline is important in all security functions, and so especially with patch and vulnerability management, we want to be able to use a thermometer to get an accurate baseline of where we're starting. And if you have other solutions, please come and talk to us on Thursday. Opportunity, I think, is a big one in this context. By definition, right, our patch management software is making advantage of opportunity just out of the box. We're relying on the expertise, the work effort of our vendors, of our software providers to monitor their software for vulnerabilities and then patch them and tell us about them. So we're leveraging some form of opportunity. If you're the sort of organization that has your own in-house software you develop, then you need to make sure that you're taking advantage of code review services, getting external experts to take a look at your code, or having internal experts that are considering security from the get-go when they start to develop. You also need to make sure that you're monitoring and fixing holes in your software as you find them. But I think the larger piece here that a lot of organizations are missing is the threat intelligence opportunities that exist very accessibly to system administrators. Your vendors, in addition to publishing their feeds of information for you to consume and deploy as patches, will also have email lists or RSS feeds you can subscribe to get information almost as soon as it happens in terms of exploits that have been patched or critical things you need to deploy. In addition to following the specific vendors that you are working with and deploying, there are organizations out there called CSIRTs, which are in general and industry-specific resources for combining and disseminating information on security vulnerabilities. One that I think everyone should be aware of is the US CERT at CISA, and they have a landing page where you can sign up for their general feed. There's also a number of industry-specific mailing lists that are available to you. And we'll have a link to those on the next slide. Also, an ISAC, so Information Sharing and Analysis Center. These will also be available to you based on what industry or sector you're in. Many states have an ISAC. We have one for higher ed called RIN ISAC that's hosted at Indiana University. And these exist in, they may have a CERT service that they distribute information on vulnerabilities, but they also allow you to hold discussions, ask questions, and talk about problems that might be unique to your specific industry or area of engagement. So I encourage everyone to find out what those resources are for the sector that you're in and subscribe to them. Some links are here on this page, uscert.cisa.gov. Head on out to that page. They have a SCADA ICS cert. They have a healthcare cert. There's a few different feeds there that you can grab intel on. And by knowing when these things happen, you don't have to rely on your patch management cycle, especially if you're a smaller shop and you're only patching every month or every other month. It's important to keep track of what the high and critical severity vulnerabilities are so you can issue patches in a more timely manner. There's also a link here to REN ISAC, and Microsoft still maintains a actual feed that you can subscribe to for information on their upcoming patches. The next principle we want to take a look at and think about is rigor. And the question we can ask ourselves in relation to patch management is, am I able to identify what hosts are missing patches? And what does my infrastructure look like to an attacker? So the correct behavior in terms of patch management that we want to enforce is that we are deploying patches safely and in a timely manner to all of our machines, and that we're not exposing known vulnerabilities to the outside world or to people who might have already breached our network internally. And so there are a few different solutions that I've worked with in this area. One is just having a good program to monitor your software inventory. A lot of the hardware inventory tools do this as well. If you're using a sort of an enterprise level solution like SECM, Satellite, SaltStack, something like that, they will all have tools available to monitor compliance with patch deployment. And those are excellent. If you don't have those sort of tools available, there are a number of different things you can do. You can use something cheaper like a PDQ scanner. But you can also, if you have a little bit of time to do some research and write some scripts, you can write a PowerShell script that will scan your network and find which patches are missing. There's a number of different things available that will tell you about that. We did a security exercise for Open Science Grid this year where we actually ran this sort of script on supercomputers distributed across the country and got latest package versions on, I think we ended up hitting somewhere in the area of 1,500 different supercomputing nodes across the United States and pulling package lists so we could find out where we had software that was out of date and compliance. So this works on all different scales and can be done cheaply and easily if you put a little elbow grease into it. The other two tools that I want to talk about, and they go hand in hand, is security exercises. I think if most of you have been to one of my talks before for Research SOC, you've probably seen me talk about security exercises. It's something that Research SOC is very on board with. We want to get everyone in the research community for NSF conducting security exercises on a regular basis. One thing that we are fond of saying is that if you're making assumptions about your environment, they're only as valid as your up-to-date information on that. So you need to be verifying the assumptions that you have made about your your systems and infrastructure. And especially with patch management, when we are going out and deploying these patches to hundreds or thousands of machines, if they are affecting critical vulnerabilities, then we need to be doubly sure that they are having the effect that we intend. One way that we can do that is with vulnerability scanning. A lot of organizations that I've worked for in the past have hired penetration testers to come in on an annual or quarterly basis and scan our networks internally and externally, and produce a report of vulnerabilities for us. Yeah, Randy says they replaced Nessus with OpenVAS and it's working well, and that's exactly what I was going to suggest. Anyone with a little bit of time and the ability to spin up a VM from an ISO can deploy Kali Linux and run. OpenVAS is actually renaming itself to Greenbone Vulnerability Manager. And you set that up. It comes out of the box installed in Kali, and you can point it at an IP range and start scanning your own network. It'll generate a very detailed report for you in the order, depending on how many hosts you're scanning, in the order of hundreds of pages. But by going through that, you can sort of see all the different severities of vulnerabilities that you have on your network, and that gives you a starting point for going down and addressing those. In a lot of cases, it's things that might be addressed by patch management. In many cases, you need to, update specific pieces of software, close specific ports, disable certain encryption protocols that you might be running that are out of date. But I encourage everyone to do this on their external facing IPs. Anything in your DMZ, anything that the internet can see, you should be scanning, because the attackers definitely are. And if they know about it before you do, it's not going to end well. So that's an exercise anyone can do. Like I said, it's much easier than I think most people expect. You can have a box up and running and get your first scan going, I would say within an hour, if you have a VM infrastructure already set up. And it'll take longer than that to run the report, and it'll take you quite a while to triage what comes out of that report. But it is worth doing as often as you have the time available to triage and look at those numbers. Kip points out that Shodan is an option as well. You can use Shodan to inspect your IPs and your ports to see what might be exposed on the internet. And we find that if you publish some sort of security email, we oftentimes get sort of these white hat hackers who scan our infrastructure, and they'll tell us about anything that we haven't already found, which at least lately hasn't happened very often, because we've pretty much been ahead of them. Let's move on to the next one. Yeah, and again, office hours, a great time. We can talk about different vulnerability scanning and tools that people have used. I'd be interesting to hear because I have my preferred methods, but this community has a lot of knowledge collectively. We'd love to get together and share that with each other. The next principle we want to look at is minimization. And I think of minimization as reducing attack surface. So am I remediating all of my external facing vulnerabilities in a timely manner? And I emphasize external facing because in this case, the attack surface, not to say that it's the only one available, but most of these sort of attacks are going to come from external to your network. We'll talk on the next slide on compartmentation about internal threats. But in this case, we want to make sure that we are prioritizing our patching so that we are hitting our highest impact and most exposed systems first. I want organizations to treat patching with sort of the SLA style of management that we would use when dealing with vendors. I think a good rule of thumb is critical vulnerabilities patched ASAP within 24 hours. High severity vulnerabilities patched within 48 hours, medium within a month to 2 months, and low severity patches within 3 to 6 months. I know even today, if you go out and look at a lot of blogs that talk about setting up patch management for Windows, they'll tell you, just do security fixes and critical vulnerabilities, and they'll ignore medium and low severity patches. But those things add up, and waiting for a patch roll up to come out, however long it's going to be in the future, a year, year and a half, is not always a good idea. So when you have the ability to patch even the low and medium severity vulnerabilities or issues that you have. Another thing in this area is make sure that you're protecting your equipment by having regular maintenance windows. A lot of times, especially the smaller places where I've worked, there was equipment that was so important that it could not go down for maintenance. And the shops were too small to really have any sort of redundancy built in, especially in the era before virtualization was so popular. We would have one server, and if it was down, there was no other option. There was no high availability for some of these companies. And so they just wouldn't take the stuff down to patch it. It would run for months and months and months. But a rule of thumb is if it's critical enough that it can't go down, it's critical enough that you need to protect the maintenance window and make sure you're getting a regular opportunity to apply updates and reboot those machines. With most organizations, I think nowadays, especially if you have decent amount of resources, you're probably able to do VM migration and keep services up. But protecting those maintenance windows, I think, is important to establish a regular cadence and make sure you are managing to patch everything that you need to in a timely manner. I've included this slide. It's getting sort of old now, but this is a timeline of exploits in the wild for a zero-day vulnerability. This is about 5 or 6 years old. And you can see in the first 10 days, there's absolutely no activity at all. Then we see a bit of a spike, and the blue line here is the first month. And then we see wild increase in the number of exploits that were found for this after about 2 months since it was released, when everyone out there's been able to look at it and start looking for machines that are vulnerable to it. So you have a window to get these things done. For critical severity things on high impact systems, get those done within a day or two. But for everything else, you can see that having this 30-day window will protect you quite a bit against known attacks. So I recommend that everyone patches at most on a 30-day cycle. Compartmentation is similar to minimization, but we're looking at things from an internal perspective. So are we patching our internal? Yeah, Steve, the y-axis is the number of, I think, reported attempted exploits of that. So are we patching our assets in a timely manner? And in this, I'm specifically looking at endpoints. We have if you want to go ahead, CJ, put up the next poll while we're looking at this slide, this will be helpful. But our endpoints, we often, put in a different tier for patches when they have different patches available to them. But we want to make sure that those are getting patched as well. One of the primary means of people getting into our network these days is through phishing or some other sort of credential stealing from a published breach, getting into user level machines and then moving laterally to infect high value targets in your network. And so patching your endpoints, while it's not as critical as patching your external facing infrastructure, shouldn't be delayed and shouldn't be neglected. You want to set and enforce deadlines if you have the ability to do so with your patch management software. And then I know a lot of us in the scientific community, we have users, researchers who are using Linux as their, yeah, it's differently critical, as Brian points out. It's just as critical, but for a different set of reasons, and it's a different set of patches and staging that you have to go through to get there. But when we have organizations that have a large number of Linux users on their endpoints, I think there's a tendency sometimes to trust those users a little bit more than we would in a traditional IT environment. And what I'm here to say is don't trust those users. When we've taken a look at some of the machines in our scientific environments and we look at the browsers that they're using when they contact certain sites, or if we have been able to do scans on these things, we find that a lot of users can have wildly out of date packages installed. It is important that you find some solution to patching your workstations, even if you have a set of technically savvy and highly skilled users on them, because they may not be doing any sort of patch management themselves, applying updates. If you're ready to close the poll, we can take a look at the results here. Yeah, it's almost a dead even split between Windows and Linux endpoints, and a mixture of things. So there's not that many tools that I know of that do effective patch management on both platforms well. They definitely exist. Salt is the one that comes to mind. Yeah, I'm not even going to touch the Mac patching because I don't know anything about it. I've never had an organization where I had to manage a lot of iOS endpoints or Mac OS endpoints. Sorry about that. I'm an Apple phobe, I guess. But there are tools out there that work on both Linux and Windows-based systems. Salt is the big one that comes to mind. Salt is quite expensive as you go into enterprise pricing for that sort of thing. We'll talk a little bit later and hopefully on Thursday about some sort of system configuration tools that can be used to on both infrastructures. But a lot of times you may end up with totally separate. Yep, Puppet is one that we're I think going to talk about on Thursday. You might end up with totally separate patching infrastructures if you don't plan for it ahead of time. So thanks everyone for participating in that poll. And if you have a mixed infrastructure and you're doing central patch management, I'd really like to hear about what solutions you found and what works well, and what is been the challenges in getting there. Let's get past that poll. The final section of our talk today, we're going to look at some next level strategies, and a lot of these, this talk is geared towards low budget, lower staff centers. So if you're from a larger center, you're probably already doing a lot of this. Jerry suggests JAMF for Macs, and I'm not familiar with that, but something I'd like to take more of a look at. So first thing is automation. I think most people who are doing patch management are automating something. I think here, sort of at the base level, right, we have Windows free WSUS, PowerShell scripts. You can manage fairly large organizations with just those two free tools. I've seen that work in organizations up to 2,000 endpoints. It gets hairy and it requires a lot of babysitting, but it can be done. You also have your enterprise tools for doing that sort of thing. Depending on what you're licensing for your infrastructure, if you have something like RHEL, right, you have tools available to you like Satellite. There's an open source version of Satellite. I think it's called Spacewalk, which can do the same sort of pulp-based patch management, but requires a bit more configuration. Typically, the more you pay, the lower your tech barrier to entry becomes on these sort of things. But that's not to say that you can't teach yourself a lot of the tools required to implement some of the open source and lower cost solutions to this sort of thing. At a basic level, right, there's always the fallback to scripting, which I'd like to see people get away from and move to more managed tools. But it's definitely better than just relying on. I know some places where people are literally still just logging into their machines and doing updates manually on critical infrastructure, and I don't encourage that. So Spacewalk is being replaced. I did not know that. It's good to know. Is that changing ownership in terms of who's maintaining that? Okay. And then the other sort of option available to us in this arena is system configuration tools. You can manage your patching using Ansible. It's not quite as powerful as using something like Chef or Puppet, but it's easier to learn, in my opinion, or at least it was when I took a look at it. It doesn't necessarily require a client, and YAML is not too difficult. There's also quite a few tutorials available for folks out there if you want to take a look at doing that. And then Chef Puppet is something that I've not used in a production environment, but when I was talking to people about this talk and large-scale solutions for patch management in a mixed environment, that came up over and over again. Randy says they're using Ansible for AWS deployment and it works great. Are you using that to deploy the machines or manage them, or both in terms of updates? Yep, both. Yep, and Ansible is something that we use a lot for keeping your systems homogeneous across a broad range of things. And I think I'm not even saying it's a downside, but it's a different philosophy between the Ansible model and the Puppet model, right? Whether it's a push or a pull style model. And that's something, again, I'd like to talk to folks more about in terms of the benefits and downsides on Thursday. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of next level stuff is running your services and applications in containers. It's something that has been going on at the higher end scale for a number of years now, but it's become more and more accessible. I think a lot more admins are getting experience working with containers. And so we see services, even in smaller shops, are able to be containerized and moved into an orchestration model of some sort. Couple of things to keep in mind if you're going to use containers for services. Make sure when you're building those, you're using the latest image and that you're using images that are maintained actively. If you set them up properly using latest images and have a policy and some sort of service running to restart those containers on a regular basis, you can actually end up with very robust automated patching infrastructure, depending on how many containers you're using and how often you're willing to set those to restart. You do need to be careful when doing container-based workflows that you have security policies in place and just general policies for your organization to make sure that you're mandating certain restart requirements on those so they don't get too far out of date. And you also want to make sure you're preserving the data and the logs coming out of containers for security purposes. You would not want to have a sort of situation where a container becomes insecure for some reason and then it's killed and you're no longer able to access any of the data that was on that container because you didn't offload it somehow. You won't be able to practice very good incident response that way. And so I do have one more slide about the use of containers in infrastructure in this community as it exists today. So if we could put our final poll up. And Zalek, I remember to have a none option for this one. So that brings us to the end. We'll let that poll stay up a little bit longer, but that brings us to the end of the content I have prepared for you all today. I'll open it up for questions and discussion. If it doesn't have to be just me answering things. I know a lot of you here have knowledge that's more specific than I do on a lot of these systems. So we'll open things up for questions, and a reminder that on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, we'll have an office hour where we can continue this conversation.
Would you like me to end the poll?
Yeah, sure, CT. Thanks.
Okay.
So looks like maybe one or two people have a large amount of containerization going on, and a lot of people are just getting started with that. So that's good. I think that's going to be an interesting area for administrators and security folks to take a look at over the next coming years. How do we keep containers secure and keep them updated? And it's a discussion I think we're going to be having a lot of in the near future. So with that, I will say we're open for questions. We'll go about 10 minutes or so, and then let everyone get out to their break for the next call. Kenneth, that is, it used to be called OpenVAS, and it's recently changed its name to GVM, or Greenbone Vulnerability Manager. I think the current version that just came out is GVM 11. Sorry for my super loud keyboard. And that is it's an open source vulnerability scanning tool that you can basically provide if you have. There's a couple other tools. Maybe we'll talk about this on Thursday some more. But if you probably have a range of IP addresses in your organization. In some cases, we work with collaborative organizations where we have a lot of people providing resources. And so one thing I found that's useful is using a enumeration tool like OWASP amass or cert.ch to find registered IP addresses to scan. It's sort of taking a page out of the attacker's playbook and look at your own infrastructure like an attacker would be coming at it. So they're probably going to be looking at your published IP addresses, finding where your DNS bindings are, and then scanning those for vulnerabilities. And so I suggest you do the same thing. Do it from outside your network, and then try it again from inside your network and see what the differences are. That'll be illuminating. I will warn you, if you've never done an OpenVAS scan and take a look at the report, it can be tremendously long. I think the first time I did one for one of the organizations I work with, we scanned about 80 hosts, and it came back at 600 or 700 pages. So it took us a while to comb through everything, and it reports on everything. So there's some tuning that has to be done. It'll give you vulnerabilities that you may not be. It'll give you vulnerabilities that you may not expect. So yeah, that's a good point. I forgot that you would not be able to click these slides. This should be available on the slides that are in the packet as a link, but I will copy it. And this is a policy that Open Science Grid has published on the internet for folks to look at. We developed it last year in response to the increasing use of containers for supercomputing nodes. And so it's sort of based off the Trusted CI framework for developing policies, and it's something that might give you a good starting point to take a look at. Yeah, Randy's got the link there to the Greenbone Community Edition. In addition, I'll mention for the Research SOC, which I'm a part of, Research SOC has a service that we offer our clients where we do continuous weekly scans of your infrastructure, and we'll provide you with customized reports and security analysts to go over it with you. If you are interested in those sort of services, you could talk to Susan. You have any more questions? Yep. let me change my screen share over here to the agenda so we can all see. CJ's linked it in chat there. You've got a 30-minute break until about 45 minutes from now until the next talk start at 4 p.m. Eastern. So. And a reminder that on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, there's another track devoted to patch management where we'll have a open sort of forum, I think. I've got a few folks that I know have a lot of experience. I'm going to ask them if they can come and be willing to answer questions so we get a wide variety of expertise in the room. And hopefully we'll have a good discussion then. So thanks everyone for coming. And I'll stick around for a few more minutes, but you're free to go and get your break in for your next call. So thank you.
Thank you.